Hi there, Isha here, and welcome to the Higher Life, where I take concepts that are considered esoteric, spiritual, psychological, and new age, and explore how you can extract the wisdom of these concepts, apply them in a way that can truly empower your life. And in today's episode, I want to talk about a topic that is really key to our liberation as a species, and this is our relationship to suffering. And in fact, how we are easily distracted out of our true purpose by seeking success and in an attempt to actually avoid what is truly being asked of us, to face and heal our suffering. Now, the reason why this is actually so difficult is because suffering is not one thing, and we are easily confused by what would be called natural suffering and induced suffering. We tend to basket it all into one experience of suffering, of pain, whether that pain is physical, psychological, psychic, or emotional. This idea that somehow we're not capable of really facing up to our suffering keeps us in a cycle of distraction. And the greatest distraction in modern history or modern times is our absolute obsession with personal success. I mean, it can be personal success, family success, tribal success, cultural success, which we see, really through sports and other more competitive avenues where we really get overly identified with our nation's success, for example. Now, when we get overly focused on success, we feel that this is actually the single pathway to happiness, to fulfillment, to contentment. We think that in sharing our successes, we create a certain sort of intimacy that we are really naturally seeking as a species. However, if you've been in this world as long as I have, half a century, it doesn't really take much observation to really understand that success is really conditional. That is, not every single human being is born into the same set of conditions. And those conditions can really attribute to whether you have access to the sort of opportunities that this type of model of success allows. Therefore, two people may be born equally talented, equally intelligent, equally capable of achieving individual personal or cultural success, but not be born into the sort of conditions that can actually support that capacity to manifest as an actual skill. We are very aware of the imbalances that are really prevalent throughout different tribes and cultures on our planet. And even between ourselves as a species and other species, we have a capacity to create realities which other species don't. And therefore we have a power imbalance with those species. We can make choices on their behalf that they necessarily wouldn't make for themselves if they had the capacity to make those choices. So we live in this superficial material reality, which is really defined by imbalance, power abuses, power struggles, with really diverse sets of conditions. And therefore, it is really logical that the most powerful way for human beings to really bond and come into a form of intimacy with each other is not really through success, or at least the model of success that we are attached to in modern humanity. However, this is very different when we start to explore the topic of suffering. In fact, natural suffering, and I will make a distinction between natural and induced suffering. However, suffering on the whole is an experience that every single human being, no matter what set of conditions they're born into, will experience at some point in their life. And in fact, being born is a form of suffering because we're born into an extremely vulnerable state, and we are very vulnerable to the conditions that we are born into. So this is most definitely a shared experience. And it really doesn't matter what conditions you're born into, what the color of your skin is, what your gender is, any other point of identification that can have you feeling the inequality and the imbalance in the world. We all experience suffering. Perpetrators experience a form of suffering and being a perpetrator just as much as a victim being the victim of that perpetrator. So it's a really complex but at the same time simple area. If we really simplify it, we can make some clear statements, and that is that humanity has the capacity to bond through suffering. And in coming together and exploring, examining, and seeking to heal our suffering, we become truly empathetic and forgiving, actually, of our differences. So it's a really incredible space to be in. But we are so afraid of suffering, especially, I think, in modern life, where this idea of not having a happy life, not feeling content, fulfilled, healthy, well in the world, is all a sign that you're not doing well, you're not succeeding. However, you can be an extremely healthy person and still experience illness, because illness is in the human system. Extremely healthy people get cancer, and extremely unhealthy people live to the age of 90. So there is no direct correlation between your personal mindset, really, and the kind of illnesses that you may experience in your lifetime. You may be born into a family system that has a genetic predisposition to certain illnesses, and yes, the conditions that you're born into therefore influence the kind of diseases that you'll get. But there is a certain powerlessness that we have over some of the experiences of suffering that we will pass through in our lifetime here on Earth. Now, this brings me to a strong distinction. If we do come into this idea that humanity has the capacity to truly become intimate and bond and unify through exploring, examining, and healing our suffering, we then come into what type of suffering am I referring to? I'm actually referring to both these sufferings, because I believe as a species we do need to address and live with both versions. However, one is a suffering that we really have very little power over, but we do actually believe that we have more power than we can actually exercise in practice, and this is natural suffering. Now, natural suffering is really what bonds us and binds us. We're all born human. We're all born vulnerable. We will all die. Our bodies will fail us. We will lose or experience loss in many shapes and forms. I feel one of the most significant losses that I've had throughout my life, and I've had some big ones. I've lost a child in an early delivery. But it's actually watching my children grow up and feeling the loss of every age that they pass through, and knowing that I'll never get to go through that again, that creates a certain sort of sadness for me, a suffering. It's a nostalgic suffering, and it's melancholic. And, I really want to honor that suffering by not wanting to avoid it, by keeping myself busy and actually spending time with my children, even in our most uncomfortable spaces, so that I don't miss out on that very short-lived experience. So this is the sort of natural suffering that every human being knows on one level or another that they're going to experience. And when we discuss and share these versions of natural suffering with others, we feel a bondedness, a connection. Now, this is not about being negative. If I go to a mother's group in my early days and talk about some of the struggles that I'm having, and that struggles are shared, it gives me space and oxygen to meet those struggles with more compassion. Now, others may believe I don't want to go into a space and be negative about my experience. But what will actually happen is that suppression of what's really going on, and that lack of connection and communion with others who can share this experience for you, isolates you. It leaves you very much abandoned. And in the end, that stress will manifest in other ways, like burnout, like aggression, like impatience. So we can't really avoid the shared experience of this type of suffering. We can pretend it's not happening. We can try and manifest things in other parts of our lives to compensate or to avoid this sense of negativity, I guess, when you don't really want to face it, in areas of our life that we don't have a lot of control over. And then we move into what would be called induced suffering. And this is fascinating, right? When you induce something, you actually bring it on. And induced suffering is the kind of suffering that we could describe as a form of cruelty, really, in its most extreme, or ignorance in its less extreme. I mean, ignorance naturally leads to cruelty. And this is the kind of suffering that comes through our limiting beliefs or our psychological immaturity. It's the kind of suffering that we experience in our families, in our tribes, in our cultures, in our nations, that is passed down from one generation to another. Addictions, insecurities, perfectionism, these are all versions of induced suffering. They're not really natural, and they come about from our psychology, these beliefs that have been passed on from one generation to the next. And that first theme that I brought in about our modern model of success is a form of induced suffering. We suffer immensely as a species trying to achieve and maintain this model of success. It's not very natural. It drains our energy and it keeps us in competition with each other, or worse, in comparison, which makes you feel very insecure when your life doesn't match the expectation of this model of success. Another form of induced suffering is enmeshment, where our sense of identity is very tied into what others expect of us, or protecting ourselves from the projections of others. These are the kind of strategies that we learn in childhood in family systems, and they are false strategies. They definitely help us at the time, but they're not really a natural way of being in the world, and therefore cause an extra layer of suffering on top of the suffering that our natural way of being in the world will already bring. So this induced suffering, it's not really the fault of a singular human being. That's why we don't necessarily blame our parents when we come to understand that a lot of our induced suffering is passed from one generation to the next, that we experienced it in our early family system. But the family unit is simply the smallest unit in larger human units that all influence each other. So the family is influenced by the tribe by the culture by the nation by the global conditions that we are living in at this time. So we have a lot of examples of induced suffering around the world. Most of the conflict and war and death and destruction and genocide is a manifestation of induced suffering, a fear of the other, a sense of difference. Now, when we look back at this initial suffering, the natural suffering, we could see that naturally led us into a sense of being a unified species. We all experience the same type of suffering when it comes to birth and death. We all have loss. So there's something very familiar that every single human being can identify with. It's a singular point of identification, this fragility, this vulnerability of being human. I spent some time a significant amount of time in recovery groups, and what's really interesting about those recovery groups is that in this space you're sharing stories that everybody can resonate with, but the type of people that are in those groups is so diverse. Every different gender, sexual identity, race, ethnicity. People come from really different conditions, wealthy, poor, and everything in between. But there is a sense of genuine knowing and familiarity in those groups because everyone is facing a similar or same type of addictive tendency and suffering the consequences of those addictions or being in families with those addictions. So it's very reassuring and soothing to be in this space of so much diversity and have this shared experience of suffering. And I can tell you, while it's very sad, and sometimes I would be in a deep state of grieving about some of the stories and shares that I was blessed to hear in those groups, it left me with a sense of belonging, a belonging that is healthy, a belonging that gave me hope and made me see that this suffering is such a fertile ground for true intimacy. Now, the induced suffering is almost something that reacts outside of that. It's very much about I have my own version of suffering and you have your version of suffering, and it's not the same, and your version of suffering has caused my suffering and vice versa. So we get very much into this differentiated suffering. Now, this is, something that I experienced or have witnessed very much growing up in Australia, where there is a strong storyline of the way that Australia was founded and the victims and the perpetrators, the white culture being perpetrator and the black culture being the victims. And there is a truth to that. Absolutely. The conditions of that time enabled a power imbalance and a power tragedy that has really scarred the way the Australian culture has evolved. And I would call this induced suffering, because we have not been able to meet each other at a place of shared suffering in which the perpetrator and victim are able to understand each other's suffering. And it's no longer about who is at blame, but actually becoming more mature and less ignorant in our experience of being human together, with some visible diversity, but when you really come under it, we're all human. We all have hearts and bodies and minds. We are all really part of one species, and every single human being, whether you are Indigenous or not, is unique. And that is really important, because the color of your skin does not determine your unique persona. It is very much archetypal. So we really need to move beyond the superficial differences that we have, and this induced suffering that remaining in this mindset really facilitates, and start to step into the raw suffering of being human, and the raw suffering of being in the family and cultural legacy that you were born into. Because we're all born into our own set of conditions, our own cultural legacy and family legacy. You can be born into a tribal culture that is the victim in the cultural storyline that you were born into. However, be born into a family system in which you received a lot of love. You can be born into the culture which appears to be the dominant and most privileged tribe in the time of history that you are living in, but be born into a family in which you are exposed to extreme abuse and addiction. It gets really complicated. It's no longer black and white. Are you a victim or aren't you? If you're born into the culture which is privileged, but into a family in which you're a victim. Are you a victim if you're born into a culture which your tribe is victimized, but you yourself and your family have received a beautiful amount of love, support, and opportunity? It's really not that straightforward. So we really need to step out of those small differentiations and come into a place of unity. And the only way that is possible is by really meeting our suffering as a species, as one species. But the way that we do that is in a very personal way. This has been the core work that I've been exploring in my own life. How our personal power can actually transform our global experience. And what I've come to understand is facing our own personal suffering in the context of our karma, that is our family legacy and our cultural legacy, but also coming to understand that there is a natural suffering in which we have no real power over, and learning to celebrate the richness that this sort of suffering brings into our lives creates a whole new reality where we all belong. And where our life story belongs, no matter what the conditions we were born into. It makes sense when we come together in a space of really honoring suffering. Now, we are so educated out of this, and that's why it's so important to realize that intellectual education, school education, it's equipping us to work in the factory of life. And these days the education is evolving. However, social intelligence, emotional intelligence, understanding intergenerational trauma, learning how to practice RAIN, that recognizing our discomfort and bringing a really beautiful, compassionate heart to it, will allow the sort of forgiveness that we need to cultivate as a species, so that we can transcend this really habitual way of manifesting this induced form of suffering based on difference, on otherness, on fear, and on separation. I think this is such a wonderful thing to consider in your life and to contemplate. Imagine that the true purpose of our lives was really to meet, greet, and honor our suffering together in shared spaces without feeling guilty and without feeling shame, and really feeling hopeful and energized and optimistic about the capacity of each and every human to meet their own suffering and to tend to it, and to feel blessed by their unique story. Some people's suffering is, induced suffering has created a level of distress that is way beyond what others have. And, we really have to wonder, what is that about? I believe that you have capacity to really honor your personal power by facing your suffering. If you sit within a tribal group and that suffering is a shared suffering, really honor that as part of a much larger system of humanity where suffering is prevalent right now. We still are stuck in wars and genocide, and this induced suffering is really creating a lot of havoc. So it is important to differentiate between natural suffering, induced suffering, to meet both with a certain amount of compassion, to rejoice in the natural suffering, and to really do the work of dissolving the induced suffering. We can make the changes internally so that we no longer perpetuate induced suffering. We can free ourselves from our family and cultural legacies by shining a light on them and understanding that they were born out of ignorance, and it's time to mature and to transcend this more basic way of being in the world. I think it's a great relief to really let go of this idea of personal success as the pathway to contentment, and to swap it out for the pathway of contentment and fulfillment being one in which you really explore suffering. It really will bring some space into your life. It'll help you detach from distraction and no longer feel these deep disappointment and despair when your life hasn't worked out the way that you thought it should. I guarantee every single disappointment is bringing you back into relationship with suffering. It'll keep bringing you back until you take on the opportunity. The universe is like that, very, very patient and resilient, and really wants every single human being to find liberation. Now, if you find this interesting, you wonder, how can I actually do this? Absolutely check out my courses at the HigherLife Academy. It's a 3-step process in which I really bring you into your authenticity, help you dissolve that false self, that false patterning that keeps you in this state of induced suffering, and really creates a sense of liberation that is sustainable. So if you like that idea, check out HigherLife Academy, www.higherlifeacademy.com, or reach out to me at isharobot@gmail.com. Until next time, take care and love life.